Today, we're diving into a civil war you've probably never heard of, but it's a war whose death toll makes the American Civil War look, well, small. We're talking about the Taiping Rebellion. Take a good look at this number, 20 million. And get this, that's the lowest estimate for how many people died in this one conflict. Some historians think it's actually closer to 30 million. It's a scale of death that is just almost impossible to wrap your head around. So let's try to put that into perspective. We all know about the American Civil War, right? A defining bloody event in U.S. history. That cost about 750,000 lives. The Taiping Rebellion, which happened at the exact same time, was at least 30 times deadlier. 30 times! That's just staggering. And that brings us to the big question, the real mystery here. How on earth does a conflict that killed somewhere between 5 and 10% of China's entire population, a war of just unimaginable brutality, simply become a footnote in the history books? How does it just fade away? Well, to even begin to answer that, you have to go back to the very beginning. And let me tell you, the way this all started is weird. There's really no other word for it. Believe it or not, this 14-year-long war that completely reshaped a nation, it all traces back to the visions of a single man who was convinced he was on a mission from God. So here is the story. It all kicks off with this guy, Hong Xiuquan. He's a would-be scholar, and he's just failed the incredibly difficult imperial exam for the third time. He's so devastated he has a complete nervous breakdown. And in that state, he has this wild dream where he visits his celestial family up in heaven. Okay, weird, right? But then years go by, he fails the exam a fourth time, and then he comes across a Christian pamphlet. And suddenly, for him, the dream makes perfect sense. The heavenly Father he met, that was God, his heavenly older brother, Jesus Christ, which could only mean that he, Hong Xiuquan, was God's other son, and he had a holy mission, destroy the demons on earth. And who were the demons? For him, it was the ruling Qing Dynasty. And there he is. That's the face of the man who went from a failed scholar to a holy warrior. It's just incredible to think that his personal crisis, his own revelation, was about to ignite a national catastrophe. Now, this wasn't just some idea Hong kept to himself. His vision quickly grew into a movement, the God-worshipping society. And this wasn't pure Christianity. It was a powerful blend of his Christian ideas with local Chinese beliefs. You have to remember, this was a time of widespread famine, corruption, and misery. So when a charismatic leader shows up with a message of divine justice, well, that message was incredibly appealing to the poor and the marginalized, especially Hong's own ethnic group, the Hakka, who felt completely abandoned by the empire. And this is the critical turning point. The movement stopped being just a religious sect. It was becoming a revolutionary army, ready to build a whole new world from the ashes of the old one. And boy, did they move fast. The war officially kicks off in January 1851. Within just 2 years, Hong's armies have stormed through southern China, taking over major cities. By 1853, they conquer one of the most important centers in the nation, Nanjing, and they rename it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. I mean, look at this. At their peak, they controlled a massive territory that was home to nearly 30 million people. They had their own government, their own official seal. This wasn't just a rebellion anymore. This was a functioning rival state aiming to completely replace the Qing Dynasty. And inside this new kingdom, they tried to create a radical new society. They did away with private land, they banned things like opium and alcohol, and in a surprisingly progressive move, they abolished the ancient, brutal practice of foot binding. But it was also an incredibly harsh regime. Men and women were kept strictly separated, even married couples, and they went on a cultural rampage, destroying Confucian and Buddhist temples and books, trying to wipe the slate clean. But this dream of a heavenly kingdom built on such extremes couldn't last. The same fanaticism that fueled its meteoric rise would also cause its spectacular collapse, from the inside out. What happened is a classic story of power and paranoia. Hong Xiuquan, the heavenly king, pretty much just retreated into his palace. Real power fell to his top generals, especially one named Hong Xiuquan, who started claiming he could channel the voice of God himself. Well, Hong grew deeply paranoid that Yang was coming for his throne, and in 1856, he ordered a bloody purge. Yang and thousands of his followers were slaughtered in a brutal internal conflict that fatally weakened the entire rebellion. So, while the Taiping leadership was literally tearing itself apart, the Qing Dynasty was regrouping. They modernized their armies under really effective commanders and began to push back hard. The Battle of Nanjing in 1861 was a devastating loss for the Taiping, and it really signaled that the tide of the war was finally turning against them. The Qing also got a little help from their friends. You see, Western powers, who were neutral at first, started to get nervous about the Taiping's instability and their anti-trade stance. So they started providing the Qing with military advisors and even a mercenary force with the amazing name, the Ever-Victorious Army. And, well, they lived up to their name, helping retake key cities.
As the Taiping kingdom started to crumble, the war just descended into new levels of horror. The Taiping, who saw the ruling Manchus as literal demons, carried out massacres wherever they found them. In turn, the Qing armies took brutal revenge, often slaughtering entire civilian populations in the cities they recaptured.
At this point, the fall of the kingdom was inevitable. But the damage it left behind, the scars of this so-called heavenly kingdom, would mark China for a century to come. The end itself wasn't some epic battle. It was just bleak. After a long and terrible siege, Nanjing finally fell. But Hong Xiuquan, the brother of Jesus, never saw it. He had died a month earlier, not in battle, but from illness after he was forced to eat wild weeds from his garden just to survive the famine in his own palace. And this is the result. Look at this map. The darkest red areas are places that lost over 70% of their population. 70%, not just from fighting, but from the famine and disease that followed. Entire regions were just left as empty, desolate wastelands. Let me say those numbers again because they're just mind-boggling. In a country of around 430 million people, up to 30 million were killed. That's nearly 7% of the entire population, gone, in just 14 years. By any measure you can think of, it's one of the worst calamities in all of human history. So what was the legacy of all this? Well, the Qing dynasty technically won the war, but it was a victory that completely broke them. The war shattered their authority, drained their money, and directly led to their final collapse in 1912. You could say the Taiping Rebellion lit the fuse for a century of revolution and chaos that ultimately created the China we know today. Which brings us right back to that first question. Why is this colossal event so unknown? Well, maybe it's because the victors were too weak to write a glorious history, and the vanquished were so totally destroyed there was no one left to tell their story. And it leaves us with a haunting thought, doesn't it? If a war that kills 30 million people can be forgotten, what else are we missing?